So here's my bias about Jesus' message to the disciples today, and Joanne read it beautifully from Mark's gospel. It's all the more real to me since being in the Holy Land, and folks here at Trinity, I'm looking at Audrey right now, who are with me in the Holy Land. When you see these unbelievable, whether it's the Colosseums or these giant pillars, you are in awe of the structures and the creation, the human-made creations. And so it doesn't surprise me that as Jesus is coming out of the temple, that the disciples are curious, like they're mesmerized. And he has some words for them that are called apocalyptic. It's a special kind of biblical language about revelation of the future, of things to come. And we quickly hear that word and we think about the corner of Dundas and Yonge Street and someone waving the Bible and warning us of what's to come and, all hellfire and brimstone. But I have a slant on this passage that I want you to think of for a minute. Jesus spent most of his ministry out in Galilee, where the have-nots, I'll call them. They were the shepherds and the fisher folk. They couldn't get a good deal with the Roman government. He's working with people in most of his ministry, with people who are really forgotten, and they're really struggling to make ends meet. They're being overtaxed. So most of his healings and his reflections of parables of challenging the world were very countercultural, what he was about. All of a sudden, though, this is just before his trial and his death. He's in Jerusalem. And to be honest, he's in Jerusalem with the haves, the people, and I'm talking about the religious haves too. These are the religious leaders who've got these grand temples. And I think Jesus is making a pretty strong message to his followers that as glorious as these temples might be, the day will come, and as history reveals, by 70 A.D., Jerusalem does come crumbling down. But he mentions, whether it's earthquakes or today we think about California fires, what I think Jesus is saying that whether we like it or not, nothing is forever. An end will come. And he concludes this passage describing a bit like birth pangs, that there's going to be pain. So this week, I've been asking people who I've been in the presence with, how do you deal with risk in your life? Are you a person that likes to risk or not? Because in this passage, if you're going to have to endure change, and even these very temples, even these places we love are going to come to an end, how do you just cope with everyday change and risk? And I'm going to give you some examples of what I heard this week, okay? I'm going to eventually weave it to my spouse. My wife is not a risk taker, so I'm going to give you a little story from her as well. So I heard a Maritimer say this week, very authentically, these are all true. He said when he was in his 20s, he thought he could go to Halifax to study, where he knew everybody. He was from Fredericton. But something in his soul said, go to Toronto. He didn't know what the heck Toronto was about. He didn't know anything. And he went to Toronto, and his whole world opened up in a new way. Yes, he longs for New Brunswick, but he's seen a lot of Canada now, and his life's never been the same. I was talking to somebody else who had two jobs. One was actually Listowel away, one was Cambridge, and he was trying to make ends meet and going to two places, and I think the permanent house was definitely in Cambridge, back and forth. And one day along 86, might be called 85 now, a big winter storm, the car spun around. Somehow there was if the rail in Wallenstein, if the rail guard hadn't been there, he wouldn't be alive to this day. He's now almost 70. And he said to me, that was the day I decided there was something more important than money. And I quit my job in Listowel, and I went part-time, and eventually it worked out in time. I spoke with somebody else who said, I don't take risks at all, but I've been at a job for almost 20 years, and I was sick of how I was being treated, and I just said, enough is enough. And something I'd never done in my life, I just quit my job not knowing what tomorrow would bring. And a year and a half later, he said, I'm better for making that decision. My wife sent me a message this morning. She's not a risk taker. This going off to Iqaluit has been a big step for her, and I'd like to go. I'll go. And she has two partner nurses, one from Comox, British Columbia, and one from Toronto. She's never met before. And so she met them in Ottawa last night. And this is the message I read for you, because Nancy's not a risk taker. She says, I've just met two nursing partners. Sylvia, I describe her as Jane Goodall. Really, she's Jane Goodall. Number two, I met Carol. She's 67. She's a fireball. She's going on 19. She has 3 adopted elephants in Africa. Anyway, my wife's learning right now there are people that just love to take risks in this world and go to Africa and all these exotic experiences. And I know she'll have the time of her life. Jesus has, I think, a pretty strong message for us if we think everything's going to stay the same. A friend this week said to me, it's been a month since his wife died of pancreatic cancer. He looked at me and he said, 50 years I've been sharing the journey with the love of my life. And he said, as a professional counselor, psychotherapist, he knows more than ever that you never know what it's like until you experience it for yourself. So he says, as I listened to people for years after years say they felt lost in the wilderness after someone they love dies, he says, I'll tell you right now, I look out at the people in my congregation who have had someone die in their life, a partner, a lifelong soulmate, and he said, I so identify with them more than ever, because he said, all I can tell you, and I actually said this to him, it reminds me of what my mother used to say when my dad had died. He said, I cannot see a future right now. Now, he's only a month into it, and he knows it is a journey. And I said to him, what my mother used to always say? She used to say, I've done it. She used to say after my dad died, I've done it all. I'd say, well, go back to church. Go play the piano again. When you are grieving, as my friend told me, there are times when you're in such deep wilderness, the temple's destroyed, things have come collapsed upon you, you can't even see a future. And we have to honor that. We really have to honor it. We wake up every morning, and I reach for the light to try to find my way to the coffee maker, try to get my orange juice or milk. And there's so many things in everyday life we take for granted in I'll call it the world of haves. That is, I expect to have electricity, I expect to have power. Dr. Kathy called yesterday, and Nancy was blown away. She called from Iqaluit. The doctor she's working with, they've known each other for 16 years. She's been up in Iqaluit for about a week now, and this is, I think, her 10th week of doing surgeries, dental surgeries. Children in the north, they really suffer from a lot of tooth decay because the food up there is, I read yesterday in the Globe and Mail, I think watermelon can be $70 sometimes, 4 times the cost of a lot of things around here. And so there's a price to pay for that for children and for all people of the Nunavut world. So Dr. Kathy's calling her on her cell phone and going, Nancy, please bring more bananas and bring more oranges. The grocery store that burnt down is opening up, I think, today. And then the doctor said, and P.S., please bring my favorite Scores. I don't know, is it chocolate, candy, or something? Scores, anyway. And this is a person who gives generously at her stage of life for, children that have a lot of needs. But even still, she's teaching Nancy very early on that what we take for granted down here, going over to Fresco or off to Zares, isn't the case not only in northern parts of Canada, but in many, many places of the world. And so I'm humbled by this passage. I'm humbled by what I take for granted. And I think Jesus has a message for me and for all of us to become far more aware of that in our life that is so important. Michael J. Fox said it so beautifully. At 55 years of age, battling Parkinson's, I'm guessing for at least 20 years, he said if Parkinson's has taught him anything, as he's battled through his alcoholism and surely depression, Michael J. Fox says, Parkinson's has taught me to treasure every single day. And so I want to close with this. My wife was just kind of like stewing about, should I go, shouldn't I go? And, I take risks a lot easier. And a colleague took her aside this week. And it kind of surprised Nancy. It wasn't something she was expecting. A colleague looked at her and said, you need to go on this trip. What are you talking about? The colleague said, you're going to get up to the north, and you're going to be in the presence of people who are going to be very, very grateful for the little bit you can do to help them. Because she said, you know what? A lot of us in this world of entitlement down here, we come to the hospital and we just expect, we expect. We almost demand we're going to get everything we want. And there are places in this world, and there are people who are just grateful. And she said, you know what? I think you're going to come back and realize why you wanted to be a nurse in the first place. That's when the new can really emerge in her life. Thanks be to God.